Hey YouTube, how's everybody doing out there? It's another nice fall day in Wisconsin, but I'm here in the garage this time, talking a little bit about cooling today. Don't these cars look beautiful? One thing I didn't notice as I was doing this video, you start at the back here with this line along the windows, down along the bottom, and it just follows through to the engine bay. It looks like a big bubble. I don't know if I can back up and get a big enough view here in the garage. They did such a good job with the lines on this car. The wide fenders and how everything just flows really well. Anyway, I get distracted by this thing even though it's 2006, so almost 12 years old. Can't believe it. Still a great car. So cooling, what kind of cooling we want to talk about? Let's talk about oil cooling. The guys with the early Z06s like mine in 06, specifically the 2006 to 2009 years, have a factory air-to-air oil cooling system, right? So what does that mean? It just takes fresh air from outside into the fender area here, the big scoop, and it's basically the front part of the vacuum of these cars. The first thing that it hits is the factory oil cooler. Sits right in front of the radiator. So all that fresh air gets forced into the engine oil cooler and cools down the oil that's flowing through the lines in it, and that oil gets sent back to the block, and it's a very efficient system. For street driving, it's too efficient. If you talk to most people that are concerned with oil temps and keeping things at the right temperatures to keep our engines lubricated optimally for typical driving conditions, I'll say. And that's what my car is. It's mostly just a street-driven car 99% of the time. So that's the context of this conversation today. So one of the caveats, obviously, is that the oil takes a long time to warm up, especially if you live in a cooler climate like I do in Wisconsin here. In the spring and fall, gosh, it takes over 10 minutes for the oil, could even be 15 minutes, for the oil to reach even 150 degrees, which most people say 150, 160 is what our oil should be before we really get on it. And I've always tried to follow that too. So I've made a couple changes in the last couple years with my oil cooling system, starting with the radiator, and then most recently this summer, to help resolve that a little bit. So like I was saying, the oil takes a long time to heat up. That's the first issue with the stock system for normal street driving. The second issue is that the oil doesn't heat up enough. So it takes forever to reach 150 or 160, and this varies by car, but on my car, it hardly ever went past that. Again, being in a cooler climate, 160 is about all I could get out of this car. Some guys say drive in a lower gear, you know. If you're just cruising though, or if you're with a car club like I'm in the club and we go do a lot of cruising, even if you're driving hard on curvy roads and you're staying in second or third gear, the cooling system out of the box on these cars is so good, you rarely see 170, 180. Most guys say that the oil should stay at 200, 210, 220. And I agree with that. So what do we do? Well, let's talk about a couple options today. Starting with the cheapest and easiest to do on up to the most costly and hardest to do. So what's the cheapest, easiest option? You've probably seen this option if you've been on the forums a lot and researched this topic like I have. Some guys wrap their oil cooler, their external oil cooler, which is in the front of the car again, front of the radiator, with products from vendors. They're called blankets, made out of heavy duty leather and vinyl with Velcro. Some guys fab up their own sheet of stainless steel or thin gauge steel and just zip tie it or tack it. so it can be secured around the oil cooler. What does that do? Well, basically just blocks the airflow, right? Less airflow into the air cooler, the oil cooler, means less cooling capacity and efficiency. So that's a pretty good option. Some guys say the oil still takes a long time to heat up. It does help with the reaching a higher temperature. I didn't go with that option because you got to get the car up in the air a little bit and take off an access panel in the front to reach that. So swapping it in and out can be problematic, and that might get old. So that's why I didn't go with that option. But it's definitely a quick and easy option just to try out. What's the second option? There's also kits that they call block-off kits, which simply you remove the entire cooling system. So the oil cooler lines that go from the pan up to the engine oil cooler in the front. Some guys leave the oil cooler on, the actual cooler itself, which is fine. It's just secured by 4 bolts. Once you take the lines off and get the oil out of the oil cooler itself, you can just leave it bolted in place. There's nothing wrong with that. So you take the lines off, and they sell this block-off kit right from GM, and it just stops. It just bolts right onto your oil pan. I'm sorry. So it effectively just removes all oil auxiliary or external oil cooling functions from your car completely. And that's fine for street use. I've seen red guys online on the forums that do that. And their cars run, 200, 210, 220 all day long. And that's a good option. It's cheap. The kit you can buy from any dealership or parts dealer online for, I think it's $25 for all the parts. It's just the little block-off kit. Includes the block itself, which bolts onto the pan, and 2 screws and a gasket. That's it. A lot of guys recommend it for just normal street driving, and I would too. I probably would have went that way if I didn't do the option I went through, which I undertook for about a year or two. It's kind of been in the making, so I probably would have went that route if I hadn't done what I've done, which I'll talk about later. So that's a second option. Real cheap, a little bit of labor, and you have yourself better oil temps and it heats up quicker. What's the third option? They actually make oil cooler thermostats that you can buy aftermarket. So instead of a block, which removes the oil cooler lines and everything completely, and it has no oil cooling, the oil thermostat, which works just like a normal thermostat for a car, it has a set temperature where it opens, right? So as your car is heating up the oil, it doesn't actually open up and release the oil through the lines into your stock cooler until whatever that temperature is that's set from that vendor on that part. I don't know if it's 200 or 220 or if it's adjustable or how all those things work. I've never tried that. I did research it. It seems like a really good option if your car is a dual purpose, track and street. So it's nice not to have to, put a blanket on and off or do any modifications for the type of driving you do. So you put the block on, the cooler on, hook your lines up to it. The one negative I read about that option is you got to buy the right fittings. They're kind of hard to find and get the right ones. But once you do that, it's a pretty good option. Some other people say be a little careful with that because you're introducing, another component in line of the factory system that it was designed to do. So, it's another failure point in the system, but I haven't heard of anybody that had any major issues with that. Once you get it hooked up right with all the fittings and everything, it's a pretty good option. And it's not too expensive either. I think those kits are $250. And then it's just time and labor. So that's a third option. What's a fourth option? And the most expensive one. I always seem to fall on the side of the most expensive. To give a little background, I had a DeWitt's radiator put in this car about 2 years ago. I just wanted a better cooling system in terms of the coolant to make sure that if I did ever track the car, I'd have a little bit better system in place to keep the water, and the coolant temperatures in check. So it's gonna be hard to see here, but you can see the silver larger radiator. It's amazing how much bigger and more capacity that has than the stock one once you take it out and you compare them. But I have the DeWitt's radiator in there. And what I did at the time when I ordered it is I ordered the model that supports both the transmission cooler hookups and the engine oil cooler hookups. So at the time it was put in, the transmission cooler lines go on the right side here on the passenger side, just the same position and location as stock hookups. So those bolted right up, and for the driver's side where the engine oil cooler hookup is, we just blocked them off. So my car was still using the factory oil cooling system. Well, after talking to my mechanic friends and others who have adjusted their systems as well, I decided it was time to change mine so my oil would run at a more appropriate temperature. So I went out, and the only other thing I needed to buy, since I already had the radiator, because we're basically switching the system from air to air to an air to water, right? We're using the air cooling the coolant, which then cools your oil instead of air to air. So some guys say you can take your factory lines from your oil pan to the external oil cooler and just hook them right into a radiator like a DeWitt's or a Ron Davis. I heard the fit was a little iffy. The lines are too long to do that. You know, you can make them work, but when you're talking about, you know, high performance cars and oil cooling systems, you know, the less bends and flexes in your lines for those things, the better. So I went out and did the recommended option of buying the Z51 oil cooler lines. Those aren't too expensive. I think I got them from Rock Auto for like $71, something like that. They fit perfect. I had a mechanic friend. I took my car over to his shop. We had it up on a lift. I think we did the job in like an hour and 40 minutes. That included an oil change. Draining the oil first really helped with the mess. We didn't really have hardly any mess, being careful as we're taking things off. It's just a matter of snaking those lines out, the stock lines out, putting the new lines in, and all the fittings are the same as the factory on the DeWitt's, so it's just a matter of plugging the lines in, filling her up with oil and checking to make sure there's no leaks, and giving her a test. So after I had it done, I took the car out. Like I was saying before, sometimes it took 10-15 minutes for the car to reach 150, 160 degrees for oil. Now it takes, you know, 5 or 6 minutes. As far as the max temps of the oil, so it definitely heats up faster, but where does the oil stop? I mean, where does it, when does it stop rising? My car, normal street driving with a little bit of spirited jaunts here and there, the oil pretty much matches the coolant. So we're talking 192, 194. That's what my coolant stays at almost all the time with this car. And now the oil stays there too. That's about all I have for today, guys. Again, this was the best option for me. I'm in a colder climate up in Wisconsin. It might not be the best option for you. Some of the other ones I talked about, the thermostat, etc. Maybe if you're in Alaska and it's really cold, you want to do the block-off kit, something quick and easy and cheap. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the options we have out there for kind of a common problem. And if you haven't thought about it before, you know, with your oil always running pretty cool, relatively cool with the factory setup, at least you have some options to think about now. Have a great day, guys. Thanks for watching. And as always, if you have any comments, questions, etc., post them up down below.